Hello, I'm your host, Brandy McCrae, for the podcast Nurturing a Child's Consciousness. This is a podcast about relationship, consciousness, and well-being, especially as those realities live in children and the adults who care for them. This is a space to explore wholeness. Each episode invites us to look at how we know our world and how children know theirs. What becomes possible when relationship, rather than performance, becomes the foundation? If you're a parent, an educator, a caregiver, or simply someone who can feel that life holds more than just managing and getting through the day, you're in the right place. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. In today's podcast, we clarify what distinguishes natural learning relationships from conventional parenting strategies and examine the underlying principles that make the approach developmentally sound, relationally coherent, and sustainable over time.
Hi, Josette here. I think one of the most important things to understand about natural learning relationships is that it is not a parenting strategy. It's not a technique. It's not a method for getting children to behave in socially acceptable ways. It actually changes the way we know and understand and see children. And once that changes, we also begin to know ourselves differently. That's why people often describe natural learning relationships as transformative, not because they learned a new parenting tool, but because their whole frame of reference starts to shift. A lot of parents come into natural learning relationships looking for help with behavior, or conflict, or learning difficulties, or emotional overwhelm, or family stress. And of course, those things do matter. But over time, many people realize that something much deeper is happening. They begin questioning assumptions and they inherited about childhood, authority, success, obedience, intelligence, emotional expression, and even love. And honestly, that can feel both liberating and uncomfortable. Because natural learning relationships asks us to move beyond managing children toward actually understanding human development. It asks us to see children as living developmental systems, not projects to shape or control. And when we truly begin to see children this way, something happens too. We often start revisiting our own childhood experiences. A lot of adults suddenly realize that many of the things that we thought were normal were actually adaptations. We recognize ways that we learned to disconnect from parts of ourselves in order to maintain attachment, approval, or safety. And often parents discover that their child's behavior is not actually the problem. The child's behavior is information. Behavior is telling us something about unmet developmental needs, relational stress or confusion, or overwhelm, or fear, or fragmentation, or lack of trust. And that shift alone changes everything. Because once we stop seeing the child as a problem, we begin asking completely different questions. So instead of, how do I control this behavior? We begin asking, what does this child really need? What is this child trying to communicate? What developmental process is occurring here? What conditions support this child's growth? And these questions naturally lead to a very different kind of relationship. And that relationship can be profoundly transformative.
So, if we're saying that natural learning relationships is transformative in all those ways that you mentioned, Josette, how are other parenting strategies or developmental models not transformative?
Hi, Bye here. And thanks, Brandy. That's a great question because understanding where the other approaches don't allow transformation, we can learn much more about how to actually bring forth transformation. The other approaches generally track and observe the behaviors and try to assess motivations of the child. They form a belief of who the child is and then act with strategies and programs to try and influence the child. Most often, it's compliance or social norms or school strategies and goals that are implemented. They manage rather than relate. Now, natural learning relationships allows us to participate in the way the child knows their world, the way they organize their world, and that they are always moving towards well-being. And many of their behaviors that are labeled dysfunctional or problematic are brilliant ways of saying that my well-being is being blocked. So what natural learning relationships does is it allows us to participate in the child's field of knowing and nature and nurture it to bring forth their well-being. In this way, we enter into wisdom-based relationships with children, as their expression of well-being reciprocally stimulates our own, and we are moving together in the field of well-being and not trying to mitigate assumed problems. We flourish together, whether it's a classroom or home life, and everyone connected to us flourishes also. In our extended experiences, many of the challenges and difficulties in family life and education literally disappear in wisdom-based relationships.
Wait a minute, Bob. When you said implement programs on children, my whole body went, ugh, gross. I dare someone to try to implement a program on me as I sit here as an adult. Just the thought of being implemented upon is revolting to me. And I realize, as a child, I had no choice. Children don't have a choice in the matter. But, I asked the listener, how did that feel? The feeling of being implemented upon. We're conditioned into this perspective that children need managing. So how is transformation possible there?
Brandy, we have to start with an understanding of what we mean by transformation. True transformation involves a fundamental reorganization of perception. Our inherited patterns begin to shift, revealing deeper meanings that inform our identity and our presence in the world in entirely new ways. It is the awakening of an inner field of knowing. From this ground, trust naturally springs forth, and a lived wisdom begins to infuse our lives with a sense of purpose and direction. Natural learning relationships is not simply adding new information into an already existing framework. Natural learning relationships is a reorganization of perception. You start seeing development differently, you start seeing and living relationships differently, and you start seeing yourself differently. And that kind of change cannot happen only intellectually. It has to be lived.
Josette here. A few things feel important to clarify. But you use the phrase wisdom-based relationships. And I want to expand on that a little because it's really central to natural learning relationships, and we haven't talked about it before. Creating wisdom-based relationships with children requires that we know how children at different ages actually organize their experiences and their field of knowing, what matters to them cognitively, emotionally, psychologically, and relationally. And children don't experience those as separate categories the way adults do. Children experience life all at once, in the moment, with their whole being. So the real challenge for us as adults is this. Can we simultaneously see through the child's eyes or feel through the child's heart and still maintain our own perspective as adults? That's not really easy. But when it happens, the relationship changes completely. I remember when we were running a school, we had several different experiences with children. For example, in helping children to create classroom values, we did an activity that can be done within any classroom with 8 to 12-year-old students for building and creating a classroom culture of care and meaning, and all students co-create together with the teacher. And in the first round, we began in the school year, and then again we did it after the winter break and in January. It can also be revisited after spring break. It's a way of building the school classroom culture together. And it goes something like this. We put out on the floor a whole bunch of words such as honesty or caring or lying and fairness or tattling and breaking promises and others. And we ask the children one by one to each pick a word that they want in their classroom culture. And kids picked honesty and caring. They picked no breaking promises. And sometimes words got picked and sometimes they didn't. And we built a big red heart that we pasted those words onto and then put it up on the wall. And of the words that weren't picked, like tattling and lying and do what I say, not as I do, then we talked about those words and why we didn't want them in our culture. And in that kind of way, children got to pick and create their classroom culture that they were invested in because it respected their field of knowing, their developmental moment. And we see that a lot with children. They really want their way of seeing the world to be respected. And I think about this in the classroom, and you could really feel the difference between a classroom organized around control and one organized around this kind of co-creation of values, which built a lot of trust. Guidance really requires relationship, and it requires attunement. It requires understanding where the child actually is developmentally, and it requires trust in the child's unfolding capacities. And when adults stop trying to force development, we can really finally begin to support it. And that changes the emotional climate of family life, classroom life, and life with children. Because children often become more cooperative, more expressive, more self-aware, and more connected, not because they were pressured into compliance, but because they were met in their field of knowing, in their way of being, developmentally, and the relationship stops being transactional, and instead it becomes a place where mutual trust can develop. And trust changes development. A child who trusts the relationship explores differently. They learn differently, they feel differently, and they question differently. And over time, they begin developing a much stronger internal foundation. Self-trust becomes possible. And I think this matters so much right now because modern life constantly pulls us away from our own inward sense of knowing. And children often learn very early to prioritize external approval over internal awareness. But natural learning relationships keeps inviting children back into relationship with their own experience. What do you feel? What do you notice? What matters to you? What feels true to you?
Josette, one of the ways that natural learning relationships has been so transformative in the relationship with myself, but also with my 10-year-old son, is this awareness around how we are conditioned to prioritize external approval over our own internal awareness. And then how do we trust ourselves enough and trust the people that we're in relationship with to navigate that together, those internal awarenesses. And it brings to mind a story from a couple weeks ago when Max had a piano recital. And he woke up the morning of the recital and said over and over he did not want to do it. He told me he plays the piano for himself, that it's not about performing, and he kept expressing that he did not want to go to this recital. And socially, as a parent, the stakes felt a little high for me. We had folks come into town for the recital. Family were looking forward to seeing the video of the recital. So there were these expectations attached to it externally for both of us, it felt like in the moment. So all morning and through the afternoon, we were having conversations about it. And he kept saying, no, I don't want to do this. So the recital is at 3 p.m. and it takes about 45 minutes to get there. So around 1 o'clock, after we talked about it all morning, I let him know that I was going to tell his piano teacher we weren't coming. And that, I understand. I do want him to play the piano for himself. And it's not performative if he doesn't want it to be. An hour later, after I text his piano teacher, so we're about 15, 20 minutes from when the recital's about to start. Max walks in the room. He says, okay, I'm ready now. I can do it. I have decided to do the recital. And then there was a huge wave of disappointment when I had to let him know that there was no way we were going to make it on time. We could not possibly get to the recital before it was over. And he was devastated because he had practiced for so long. He's actually really good at his song. And he realized that he might have to wait a whole nother year to play something like this in front of people again and to prepare and all of that. And I think, as we even had a conversation about how he had reorganized, how he went from being very resistant to being prepared. And he told me, I was more dysregulated and I was nervous, but I got regulated and then I decided I could do it, that I had the energy to do it. And because of natural learning relationships, I can see how we were both reorganizing. There was something making him hesitate in the moment. And instead of labeling that as pathological or something that needed to be fixed, or he just needed to push through, even though I had my own doubts, I was facing the external pressure as well. I stayed with him in that process of organizing, helping him, just being with him as he organized this within himself instead of us organizing towards an outcome. And it was intense. I mean, this was a whole day of a process. And I doubted myself during, I doubted myself after when he had changed his mind and he was so disappointed. But I still had that self-trust to just stick with it and hold that space for both of us. And it transformed us both. And because I had that opportunity to step into my own internal awareness over all of this external approval. So I had to kind of like walk the talk myself in that moment. And that's just one example of how natural learning relationships has been transformative for me, is that it's not outcome based and that we're always reorganizing together.
Brandy, you've just described a genuine liberation that's free from a pathological or outcome concern, that has worked with many people with whom we've worked, and that I can personally vouch. It takes a lot of energy to do the management, a lot of energy to worry about outcomes, and a huge amount of energy to worry about a possible pathology in our children or students. That energy is now yours, it's Max's, it's available. It's not confined to or subject to some outside implementation, as you so clearly stated your dislike of. And many times parents have said, I love what you're saying, but there are so many outside influences that say otherwise. And I always say, it's just you and the child, or you and the class, and free from the limitations and conditionings of pathology, of outcome concerns. There's abundant energy for transformation. You don't even have to work that hard. And I ask you, Brandy, to just jump in here for a second. Once you allowed it to happen, was it that hard of work for you?
No, it wasn't. It was not that hard. It was just being present and staying with whatever arose next.
We have to be available for the child. We have to know and see and feel how they organize, how they love and care in their world. And of course, we want to reply to that. We want to connect to that.
You know, Brandy, your story brings out something else, and that is how transformation changes the adult too. Having children often becomes what philosophers call an epistemologically transformative experience, which really is just a way of saying that the experience changes us so deeply that we cannot fully know ahead of time who we will become through living it. And honestly, I think most parents recognize that. You can prepare intellectually for parenthood, but there are parts of it you just simply cannot understand until you live inside the relationship itself. And this isn't only philosophical. We're now seeing strong scientific evidence for this as well. When we begin engaging children in deeply relational and developmental ways, we ourselves begin changing. Our awareness changes, our emotional capacities deepen, our understanding with trust changes, our relationship with control changes, and even our understanding of learning and identity can change. And motherhood, especially, is increasingly being understood as a profound developmental transformation. Researchers studying the maternal brain have found measurable neurological changes during pregnancy and early caregiving. Areas related to empathy, emotional attunement, vigilance, emotional processing, and relational sensitivity all reorganize. In other words, motherhood is not simply a social role layered onto an otherwise unchanged person. A woman herself is developing. Our perceptions change, our priorities change, our sensitivities change, our emotional world changes. And many women describe becoming more aware of dependence and responsibility and interconnectedness and the deeper realities of human life itself. I think this matters because our culture often treats motherhood primarily as a logistical labor or a role performance rather than developmental transformation. But becoming a mother or even a parent can reorganize identity itself. It can expose unresolved wounds. It can deeper compassion. It can awaken capacities that previously remained dormant. And it can also create enormous inner conflict when cultural expectations collide with biological and relational realities. That's one reason many mothers begin questioning inherited assumptions about parenting, education, work, what is success, and even what it means to live well. Natural learning relationships often deepens that developmental process because the mother is simply not just managing a child. She's participating in a living developmental relationship that continually asks for greater awareness, attunement, flexibility, humility, and even self-reflection. I think many women discover that motherhood becomes a profound path of human development in its own right, not because mothers are perfect, but because the relationship itself invites psychological, emotional, relational, and even existential growth.
So, Gisette, what you've shared emphasizes that relational field is open, and what you've described, begins the changes that happen between mother and child at birth. It starts there, but it doesn't stop. And natural learning relationships gives parents and caregivers the freedom to know the child's heart, to know how a child is organizing their world as they grow and develop. And it gives them the freedom to meet the child right where they are.
Go back to the definition of transformation that we talked about earlier. Let's take it sentence by sentence and ask ourselves, have we fulfilled our promise that natural learning relationship allows for transformation? We said that true transformation involves a fundamental reorganization of perception. What has reorganized? The liberation from our attachments to outcomes and conditionings, to our obsessiveness about and worry about pathology. We are liberated to now perceive through the child's eyes, feel through their hearts, how the child sees and knows their world. We said our inherited patterns begin to shift, revealing deeper meanings that inform our identity and our presence in the world in entirely new ways. And Josette, you just described that just beautifully in terms of a mom's birth and throughout their lives. And as a dad and as a person who's just enjoyed so many wonderful relationships with young people, I've watched my internal pattern shift. For instance, my early fears of violence, since I grew up in a semi-violent household, and so had some real concerns about creating masculine relationships and so on.
I'm going to pause here for a moment because we have something really exciting to share. So many of you have reached out asking how to get involved or how to explore this work more deeply. And we're happy to say that in July, we're launching the Natural Learning Relationships Introductory course. This 7-week experience offers an introduction to the ideas we explore here on the podcast. So child development, relationships, well-being, and the innate capacities that unfold through human development. People often tell us that this work transforms not only the way they see children, but the way they understand themselves and their relationships and the people around them. This introductory course can be taken on its own, or it can serve as the first step in our 12-month certificate program, which includes 10 courses and a practicum. And because this work is deeply relational, we intentionally keep the cohort very small. Enrollment for the July cohort is already open. Folks are enrolling and participation is capped at 8 people. If you'd like to learn more or express interest, visit transformativedynamics.org and fill out the interest form, or check the links in the show note. One more thing. Thank you to everyone who's already sending questions and reflections about the podcast. Every few episodes, we'll be setting aside time to respond to listener questions directly on the show. You can send questions or comments to the contact form on our website or by emailing Ba directly, ba@lovemoreconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to the conversation.
We said it's an awakening of an inner field of knowing. From this ground, trust naturally springs forth, and a lived wisdom begins to infuse our lives with a sense of purpose and direction. And as I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days, I was remembering that in the cohort that just completed the Natural Learning Relationships Certificate Program, we offered, as you know, I think it was 8 or 9 consecutive courses from all different approaches to relating to trauma, to African wisdom, to just on and on. But the one that we offered that was most important to people, and which they said repeatedly, was a program in the Natural Learning Relationships autobiography. By going back, first, of course, they'd been steeped in NLR understanding. And then we asked them to go back and to do an in-depth and intimate understanding of their own lives through a natural learning relationships lens. And I was frankly surprised that they singled this out as the most meaningful program of cohort members. For instance, one of them was so clear. They said, "Oh, you mean when they were telling me bad when I was 10 years old, I wasn't bad, but I was protecting my sense of trust, so I was telling them they were hypocritical?" Another one said, "God, they told me I was a rebellious, defiant teenager, and all I wanted to have was a bit of autonomy and a bit of a chance to explore my ideals and see what was really important to me." And that shift to oh, wait a minute, I wasn't a bad kid. This inherent well-being, this inherent way of living the world through trust and autonomy, I had to protect that in some way, and this was the only way available to me. So that is the way NLR brings about transformation for adults, and certainly as we go through the way of nurturing and nourishing the fields of knowing in children more deeply in future podcasts. It's the way that allows the inherent transformation to be the child's lived experience without the confusions of separation, without the confusions of excessive social norms that continually ask them, are they good, they're bad, and put all these implementations on them.
In my reading recently, I came across the term evolutionary impulse toward growth. And I think it connects deeply with natural learning relationships. The basic idea is that living systems carry an innate impulse toward growth, adaptation, greater awareness, and a fuller expression of life. So, in other words, human beings are naturally moving toward development when conditions support that movement. Children don't need us to manufacture development. Development is already trying to happen when conditions and the environment support that development. Our role is really to stop interfering with the processes that support healthy growth and instead create conditions where life can organize more fully. To create conditions where, for example, trust can deepen or consciousness can expand and authentic relationship can emerge. And when adults begin experiencing that directly, we start understanding why natural learning relationships feel so transformative, not because it promises perfection, but because it restores relationship with something deeply true and deeply important about life itself. Once people experience that shift, it becomes very difficult to see children or relationships or even themselves in the old way again. Because natural learning relationships restores trust in development itself. And for many adults, this is the first time they seriously consider that development is actually lifelong, that growth does not stop in adulthood, that parenting itself can become a path of human development. And honestly, I think that's one of the most hopeful aspects of life with children. The relationship becomes reciprocal in a profound sense. As we support the child's development, the child simultaneously reveals places where we ourselves still need to grow, and that can be very humbling. It can also awaken enormous compassion, because many parents suddenly realize, hey, my child is struggling with something, and it was never fully allowed to develop in myself. And that recognition alone often softens judgment. It increases empathy for the child and for ourselves. It opens space for self-inquiry, and it changes the emotional tone of the relationship. Natural learning relationships is transformative because it reconnects development with meaning. Relationships become less organized around performance or compliance or image, and much more grounded in truth, authenticity, and real human connection.
Josette, it reminds me of how natural learning relationships describes our organization towards well-being, that this development's unfolding and that pathology appears when there's something blocking well-being, that impulse, like you said, towards growth and that natural flow. And so often we focus on removing the pathology. All of our focus is on the pathology and on fixing it. But what I've heard you say and what I've experienced myself is that, when that flow of well-being is nurtured, when that growth and the developmental needs are met, it flows freely. And those pathologies, those problems, like you said, Bob, they disappear.
You know, Brandy, Aristotle coined the term entelechy to mean the complete actualization of a person's potential. Leibniz, person who brought forth calculus into our world, coined the term monad, which represented the entire universe through pre-established harmony to create the best of all possible worlds. Meister Eckhart said, if we knew God, we wouldn't need churches. Aristotle didn't start a trend. He simply noticed what so many others have. Leibniz, Aldous Huxley, Maslow, Carl Rogers, Gregory Bateson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Francis Wicks, Alice Miller, David Bohm, Krishnamurti, Thomas Merton. I could go on and on and on. Many of the holistic educators, many of the spiritual philosophers who aren't trying to promote their religion, but are more inclined with remembering our essential human well-being. And now, in our modern times, as Ed just said, we have an understanding of EI. What did you call it, Josette? Epistemological intelligence?
Evolutionary impulse towards growth.
Well, there you go. Close enough. And yes, that is unmistakable. When we have a conflict, it's two forces have come together. That's what a conflict is, that aren't in agreement. Everyone is interested in the outcome of the conflict. Oh, there was this behavior, or does this mean this child's not well? But what is trying to come forward? If we get on the side of what is trying to come forward, then we'll see that it's well-being, and well-being is much more powerful than any imputed or implemented. I lose my breath when I think about it. Again and again, we have to see well-being as the essence of our humanness, our wholeness, our beingness affirmed again and again. Natural learning rhythms as transformative? Yes. By allowing us to live our nature, our freedom, from unnecessary suffering and conditioning.
So basically, you're saying we're always, as human beings, in process. Children are not fixed identities, and honestly, adults aren't either. Human development is ongoing throughout life. And when we really begin to understand that, something softens. We become less rigid with children, less rigid with ourselves. We stop defining children by temporary behaviors or developmental struggles, and we stop defining ourselves by our past mistakes or old adaptations or earlier versions of who we were. Instead, we begin relating to growth itself. We develop. We have possibility. We understand that human beings continue unfolding across the lifespan. And I think that creates hope and resilience, because if people are still capable of growth, then relationships can change, families can change, patterns can change. Natural learning relationships transforms how adults understand power as well. So let's redefine power and authority. Let's look at conventional parenting, which often assumes power means control. But actually, in natural learning relationships, we understand power very differently. Real relational power comes from awareness, presence, trustworthiness, from emotional regulation, coherence, and ultimately from wisdom. And children respond much more deeply to that kind of authority. Not authority based in fear or authority based in grounded relationship is what we're looking for. That distinction matters because fear can produce short-term compliance, but trust supports long-term development. Ultimately, natural learning relationships is deeply future-oriented, not in the sense of trying to control the outcome or produce a perfect child, but in understanding what kinds of relational experiences support healthy human beings over time. What kinds of relationships help human beings become more connected, aware, more compassionate, more capable of living fully and responsibly in the world? What are we really asking? Well, what helps children become internally grounded adults? What helps human beings develop self-awareness, empathy, discernment, being truly creative, emotional intelligence, a sense of purpose and meaning, and genuine connection? Because these are the capacities do not primarily develop through coercion or control. They develop through lived relationship, through experience and trust, through meaningful connection with other human beings. And that's why we're suggesting that using natural learning relationships matters so much, because the quality of our relationships shapes the quality of human development. And I think one of the deepest insights in natural learning relationships is realizing that development is not simply about survival. As human beings, we are not only trying to survive, we're also trying to be, to grow, to connect, to create meaning, to participate fully in life. And children naturally move toward those capacities when the relational environments supports well-being and healthy development.
And so as we've come to the end of the podcast, but before I talk about the next podcast, Josette, you just said something that I think is very important, and I'd like to kind of expand on it. And you said that humans are always in process. Kind of want to say that humans are process. I don't.
We're verbs.
Well, not just verbs, but that the wholeness of our understanding is what is the world to us, except our very understanding, our very consciousness, our very way of knowing. And our way of knowing is only this unfolding change, this unfolding process. And all of when you talked about power and authority, there are ways to try to shape or even inhibit that which we are, which is this very process ourselves. So, friends, we have come to the end of this week's podcast. Now, many of you have been wondering and have questions about all that we've done so far. And we understand that
Hello,
it takes some
I'm your
time
host,
to
Brandy
begin to
McCrae,
understand
for
and
the
especially
podcast
to try
Nurturing
to
a Child's
implement
Consciousness.
natural learning
This is a
relationships.
podcast about relationship,
I'd like to remind
consciousness,
you
and
that
well-being,
what we're offering to
especially
you
as those
is
realities live in
half
children
of an
and the adults who
understanding.
care
By
for
that
them.
I mean that
This
if
is
you
a
don't
space to
start to
explore
play with it
wholeness.
and practice
Each
it and
episode
see
invites
how to
us to
live
look
it,
at how we know our
then
world
it's not going to
and how
come
children know
alive.
theirs.
In
What
the
becomes
process,
possible when
we've started to
relationship rather than
receive
performance
emails.
becomes the foundation.
And in the
If
next
you're a parent,
podcast,
an
in 2
educator,
weeks,
a caregiver,
we will be
or simply
focusing
someone
on
who
your
can feel
emails.
that life holds
Some
more
have
than
been
just
asking
managing
us
and
for
getting
greater
through the day.
elaboration on
You're in
things
the
we've
right
already
place.
said. Some have been asking us to make some connections
Hi,
that
everyone.
they're starting
Welcome
to sense in
today's
themselves
podcast,
and
we
how to bring
clarify
them
what
forward.
distinguishes natural learning
These great
relationships from
questions have
conventional
been sent
parenting
on all
strategies
aspects
and
of our
examine the
first
underlying
5
principles that make
podcasts,
the approach
and we are
developmentally
excited
sound,
to address them all.
relationally coherent,
There
and
is still
sustainable
time to
over
write to
time.
us for inclusion in the
Hi,
next
Josette here.
podcast.
I think one of the most
Here's
important
how.
things to
You can
understand
write
about
directly
natural
to
learning
me.
relationships
That's
is that it is not a
BA
parenting
at
strategy. It's not a technique. It's not a
lovemoreconsulting.com.
method for getting children to
That's
behave
ba
in
at
socially acceptable ways. It actually changes the way we know and understand
consulting.com.
and see
In the
children.
meanwhile,
And once
visit our
that changes,
homepage,
we also begin to know ourselves differently. That's why people often
www.transformative.org,
describe
to
natural
learn
learning
more about
relationships
natural
as
learning
transformative.
relationships
Not
and our
because they
dual
learned a new
certificate
parenting
program.
tool, but because
There
their
you can
whole
learn
frame
all you
of
need to
reference
know
starts
about
to
joining our
shift.
next
A lot of
cohort,
parents
which
come
is now
into
forming.
natural learning relationships
So
looking
this
for
is
help
Ba
with
Lovemore,
behavior or
Josette
conflict
Lovemore,
or learning
and Brandy
difficulties or emotional
wishing you
overwhelm or
optimal
family
well-being
stress.
for
And of
you
course,
and your
those
loved
things do
ones,
matter. But over
dedicated
time,
to
many
all
people
children
realize that something
everywhere
much
and
deeper is
always.
happening. They
See you
begin
in 2
questioning
weeks.
assumptions